For these people, Manhattan is home, journey's end. For me, it is a point of departure, journey's beginning.
Next thing will be at the 510 train to Philly, stops in Newark.
This is Penn Station, once one of the great railway termini of the world. Today, it doesn't look or even feel like a railroad station. More like a lower-level shopping precinct, a sanctuary from the hubbub above. I buy my ticket at a counter that looks like a bank. And as at banks, there are always those who think they got there first.
Excuse me, ma'am, I'm just getting a ticket here. Could I have a ticket from...
I have none, ma'am.
The slip that I gave you with the number on it.
I have no slip here, ma'am. Haven't got your slip.
I'd like a ticket from New York to Los Angeles, please.
Well, New York to Los Angeles?
All the way through.
When do you like to travel, sir?
I'd like to travel this afternoon on the Broadway.
The Broadway Limited to Chicago, departing 3 o'clock, is now receiving passengers to the west gate of track 14, west gate track 14. Stopping at Harrisburg, Altoona.
The place names are reeled off as casually as stopping places on a bus, but they'll take a day and a night to cover.
Gary and Chicago, west gate track 14.
There's nothing quite like the sense of anticipation at the start of a long journey. And this one to Los Angeles is 3,000 miles. One knows what one thinks it'll be like. How different will it be in reality?
On the board.
This train's on its way to Chicago, 1,000 miles away. Last time I made this journey 30 years ago, it was in one of America's crack expresses of the 20th century. Then, before the great glut of motorways and jumbos, a score of similar trains left New York daily. The Broadway is one of a handful of survivors. In the last 100 years or so on this route from coast to coast, millions of passengers have preceded me. One was my fellow countryman, Robert Louis Stevenson. He found, as I hope I shall, that taking a train journey across a country is as good a way as any of getting to see it and meet some of its people. His train was crowded with immigrants. This one is half full. Yet had we been making the trip in midsummer, we'd have had to book a month beforehand. Americans go by train for several reasons. Some belong to the 20 million who are too scared to fly. Some belong to the 20 million who don't own a car. And some just find the train a pleasant relaxation, having the freedom to move around, play cards or read, eat or drink at leisure, or even complain about the trains.
We pay as much for one trip from Harrisburg to New York as you would pay probably for a month or 2 months transportation costs.
They just did away with 5 trains.
Yeah, they took five of our main trains off. But it still, economically, is cheaper to use the train than to drive to New York and spend days there. You pay $12 a day for car storage. You take a train, you have a couple hours trip, You get in a cab, you have 15 minutes, and you're at any hotel you want to go in New York. Economically and practicability, it's more feasible to take the train with lousy service.
Our trains are never on time. 1 to 2 hours late.
They don't try to accommodate you, they try to decommodate you.
American railroads are nothing like what they were. In the 50s, when air and automobile travel came into its own, the big companies went bankrupt one by one. And in 1971, Congress established Amtrak, the US equivalent of British Rail, to take the long-distance passenger trains over. For Amtrak, it's been an uphill struggle, operating engines and coaches that are more than 30 years old, using lines that still belong to the private companies and where their freight always has priority. Little wonder that Amtrak's trains are often slow, noisy and uncomfortable, and only rarely arrive on time.
Calvin is cooling the most of my ride on. See, I run Chef.
Today, the Broadway Limited has an extra coach attached to it. It's the Pennsylvania, built 51 years ago as a perk for the president of the Penn Railroad. In those days, millionaires' private coaches were almost 2 a penny. This, one of the few survivors, is the hobby of a New York lawyer called George Pins.
I think that there are certain things in one's life that we look at and say, I am going to have that, whatever the cost may be in money or other things. And this was one of those things in my life. I saw this car very much by chance, but when I saw it, I realized it had great historical value, and I resolved that I was going to be the person who would purchase it and restore it and operate it in the grand tradition of American railroading, which is what I've attempted to do in the 9 years that I've owned it.
If you want to hire a Pennsylvania for a holiday, complete with cook and steward, it'll cost you $500 a day. It still costs George Pins about $20,000 a year to maintain it.
It's a big loser because the cost of maintaining something like this in operating condition is considerable. However nice it might look, it's 51 years old. And there are appliances on this car which must be maintained, which must be kept in a safe operating condition, and they shake and rattle down the railroad, and they are expensive to maintain. It's like an old house that vibrates all the time. You have to love it.
Maybe it was the state of the track or the age of the coach, maybe the sameness of the scenery, but I didn't find traveling in Mr. Pins's coach quite the joyride I'd expected. And as for the observation platform, it was not only drafty and cold, but I had to hang on for dear life in order not to lose my balance. As the sun goes down, we approach the Susquehanna River, the beauty of whose name, said Robert Louis Stevenson when he arrived here, equaled the beauty of the land. And a little later, we glide into darkened Harrisburg, named after a Yorkshireman who settled here 250 years ago. On this short leg of the journey, 150 miles from New York, we are, miraculously, on time. Here they unhitched the Pennsylvania and shoved it into a siding. An operation that cost Mr. Pins another $120. In the siding, I was Mr. Pins's guest at dinner, along with 80-year-old Rogers Whittaker, generally acknowledged to be America's greatest railroad buff, who on tracks all over the world has traveled 2.5 million miles and who's seen the American passenger service decline year by year.
Well, if I'm going from New York to Seattle by rail, It now takes approximately 30 hours, that is a day and 1/4 more than it did 20 years ago, simply because of the miserable scheduling brought on by the miserable state of the track, by the miserable state of the equipment, and by a certain number of miserable employees.
But if I said to you, Rogers, you know, you're really a dinosaur living in the past.
Oh, I've been a dinosaur for over 3 or 4 generations now, and I'm beginning to like the role. What's the rest of the question?
Dinosaur or not, Rogers knows what he's talking about. He worked on the railroads in his youth. He was one of Amtrak's early advisors. Trains may be old and slow, he says, but compared with other forms of travel, by God, they're safe.
We're told that the highways are magnificent. On the day of a small accident on Amtrak in the New York Times, a picture of the wreckage was on the front page. Back on page 24 was a small item, 2 inches high, in type. The National Transportation Safety Board had said that in 1978, 50,000 people had been killed on the highways. Right. Don't get on the safe old trains. Get on the safe old highways and get yourself killed. 2,300,000 people hospitalized in 1 year. What is that, 40,000 people a week?
Rogers, tell me about the old days of riding on the great trains like the Super Chief. And did romances spring up on these trips?
Oh, I regard that as a terribly personal question. Yes. In a word, as far as I'm concerned, twice. Not bad either, as I recall. I hope you have any more questions like that.
May I propose a toast?
Well.
God save the railroads.
God save the railroads.
But today, not even the Almighty could save the railroad at Harrisburg. Here, in the ruins of the capital of Pennsylvania's mainline station, is the story in miniature of the decline of the American passenger service. It's a far cry from what the Harrisburg Times wrote in 1906, just 2 years after this building was completed. There is no town in Pennsylvania, it said, that is so advantageously situated with respect to railroad connections as Harrisburg. From every point of the compass, these great public thoroughfares of travel and trade enter the borough, and passengers and freight trains arrive and depart almost every hour, giving to the town, or at least that part of it adjacent to the depot, a scene of constant bustle and activity. That evening, having said goodbye to Mr. Pins and the Pennsylvania, we were on our way again on the Broadway's overnight journey to Chicago.